The envelope arrived on a quiet morning. Nothing about it looked special. Plain paper. Black ink. No apology. Just numbers. When I opened it, my hand stayed still for a long moment because the number printed in the middle of the page did not make sense. My rent had doubled. Not increased. Not adjusted. Doubled. The letter gave me 30 days. 30 days to accept the new rent or leave the apartment where I had lived for 14 years. 14 years. I raised a child in that apartment. I watched birthdays happen inside those walls. I spent sleepless nights at the kitchen table worrying about bills while rain tapped on the window. And now the landlord had decided that all of that meant nothing. I read the letter again. Then again. Something about the wording felt cold. Almost rehearsed. The sentence that kept pulling my attention was short and simple. Market adjustments require this change. Market adjustments. I sat down at the table and stared at the wall. At 55 years old, starting over somewhere new was not simple. Moving costs money. Deposits cost money. And rent everywhere had become absurd. The landlord knew this. Everyone in the building knew this. Which meant something else was happening. People do not double rent unless they want tenants gone. That thought stayed in my head all afternoon. By evening, the hallway outside my apartment sounded different. Doors opening. Whispers. Someone arguing on the phone. The letter had reached everyone. I stepped outside. Mrs. Delgado from apartment 3B held the same paper in her hand. Her eyes looked tired. She asked me if I had seen it. I nodded. She laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes the mind reacts that way when things become too heavy. Down the hallway, a young couple stood near the stairs. They were already talking about moving. Fear spreads quickly when housing becomes uncertain. The landlord understood that very well. Inside my apartment, I placed the letter on the table again. Something still felt wrong. Not the rent increase. The timing. 3 weeks earlier, the landlord had refused to fix the elevator. 2 weeks earlier, the heating system failed for a full night. Last week, a maintenance worker removed the laundry machines from the basement without explanation. Those things had annoyed everyone. But now they started forming a pattern. When someone wants tenants to leave, they do not always say it directly. Sometimes they make living there uncomfortable. Sometimes they increase the rent until people surrender. I looked again at the letter. Then I noticed something strange. At the bottom of the page was a reference number connected to the building property record. Most people would ignore that line, but I did not. Years ago, I handled paperwork during a difficult divorce. Legal documents stopped intimidating me after that. Numbers and references always lead somewhere. Curiosity pulled me toward my laptop. I typed the reference number into the county property database. The screen loaded slowly. When the page appeared, I leaned closer. The ownership section looked normal. The landlord's company name sat at the top, but one line below it made my stomach tighten. Loan status. Past due. Not one payment. Several. The building was behind on its mortgage. I leaned back in my chair. That changed everything. A landlord raising rent during financial trouble does not always mean greed. Sometimes it means panic. And panic leads people to make reckless decisions. A thought began forming quietly. If the landlord could not pay the loan, the bank would step in. Banks do not negotiate feelings. They move straight toward foreclosure. I had heard stories about foreclosure auctions before. Investors showing up with briefcases full of money. Buildings changing ownership within minutes. Those stories always sounded distant. Until that night. Because suddenly the building where I lived was sitting in the same situation. The rent increase was not just about money. It was about emptying the building quickly. Empty buildings attract developers. Developers bring buyers. And buyers bring fast sales. The landlord was preparing an exit. But something about the numbers on the database page kept bothering me. The loan balance was enormous. Larger than the building value. Which meant one thing. If foreclosure happened, investors might stay away. Risk scares most buyers. I sat quietly for a long time. The idea arrived slowly. So slowly that I almost laughed when it appeared. At first it sounded ridiculous. Almost insulting. I was a tenant struggling to pay rent. I was not a real estate investor. I did not own companies. I did not attend auctions. But the thought refused to leave. If investors stayed away from a risky property, someone else could step in. Someone unexpected. Someone who already understood the building. Someone who knew every broken pipe. Every damaged wall. Every tenant who needed stability. My heart started beating faster. Not from fear. From possibility. Buying an entire building sounded impossible. But impossible ideas sometimes hide in situations where nobody else is paying attention. I looked at the rent increase letter again. The landlord believed this paper would push me out. Instead, it had done something else. It had shown me the landlord's weakness. And weakness inside a business deal changes the entire balance of power. The thought formed into a quiet sentence inside my mind. If the landlord wanted me gone, maybe I should stay. Not as a tenant, as the owner. I closed the laptop. The room became silent again. Outside, the hallway buzzed with nervous voices and moving boxes. Everyone believed the story had ended. The landlord raised the rent. Tenants leave. Building changes hands. Simple. Predictable. But stories only follow that path when nobody interrupts the plan. And at that moment, I decided something. If the landlord thought that letter would remove me from this building, they had just made the biggest mistake of their life. Because the moment I finished reading it, I started planning how to buy the entire place. And the landlord had absolutely no idea. The morning after I read the letter, the building felt different. People moved through the hallway with quiet tension. Boxes appeared outside doors. Someone from the second floor argued loudly on the phone about moving trucks. Fear had already started doing the landlord's work. When rent doubles overnight, people do not ask questions. They run. But I stayed inside my apartment with a notebook open on the table. The property database page still sat on my laptop screen. Past due mortgage payments do not happen by accident. They happen after months of financial pressure, which meant something had been building long before the letter arrived. I wrote down the loan number from the property record. Then I started searching again. Public records can reveal more than people realize. Most tenants never check them. Landlords count on that. After several minutes, another document appeared on the screen. A refinancing agreement from 3 years earlier. The landlord had taken a large loan against the building, far larger than the property's market value at that time. I leaned closer to the screen. That meant the landlord had expected the building to become much more valuable later. Developers often do that. They borrow aggressively. They raise rents. They push tenants out. Then they sell the empty property to someone planning luxury apartments. Suddenly, the rent increase made perfect sense. But something still did not add up. If the landlord planned redevelopment, why wait until now? Why risk foreclosure? I opened another document. Then another. Then the answer appeared. The loan required large monthly payments that had started last year. The landlord had missed several. The bank had already issued warning notices, which meant the building stood on the edge of foreclosure. I closed the laptop and stared at the wall again. The landlord was not just greedy. The landlord was desperate. Desperate people make careless moves. That thought stayed in my mind all day. Later that afternoon, I stepped into the hallway again. Mrs. Delgado sat on the stairs with a worried expression. She asked if I had found a new place yet. I told her no. She shook her head slowly. Then she told me something unexpected. 3 apartments upstairs had received eviction notices earlier that year. Not for unpaid rent. For minor lease violations. One tenant had a visiting cousin stay too long. Another had placed plants on the balcony. Small excuses. At the time, those evictions felt random. Now they looked strategic. The landlord had been clearing tenants gradually, preparing the building. I returned to my apartment and opened the laptop again. Patterns reveal truth. When enough pieces connect, the full picture appears. And the picture forming on my screen looked ugly. Missed mortgage payments. Gradual evictions. Maintenance problems ignored. Then suddenly the rent doubled for everyone. The landlord wanted the building empty quickly. Very quickly. Which meant the financial pressure must be worse than I first thought. I searched the court database next. Several minutes passed before a result appeared. My chest tightened. The bank had already filed a legal notice. Pre-foreclosure status. That meant the clock had started ticking. Banks usually give 90 days before forcing a property sale. 90 days. 3 months. I leaned back in the chair slowly. 3 months before the building might be auctioned. 3 months before ownership changed. 3 months before investors arrived looking for cheap property. The thought returned again. What if investors stayed away? Risk scares them. And this building carried plenty of risk. Old plumbing. Unstable tenants. Repair costs. Legal disputes. Many buyers prefer easier deals. That meant a strange possibility existed. Someone ordinary could compete at that auction. Someone who understood the building better than any investor walking in off the street. Someone who already lived there. My mind started racing. But before the idea could grow larger, something unexpected happened. A loud voice echoed from outside. I stepped into the hallway again. The landlord stood near the entrance talking to a man in a dark suit. Their voices carried through the stairwell. They had not noticed anyone listening. The man in the suit sounded impatient. He mentioned missed payments. He mentioned deadlines. Then he said something that froze me in place. If the balance is not resolved within 60 days, the bank will proceed. 60 days, not 90. The situation was worse than the public records showed. The landlord responded with anger. Promises. Excuses. But the banker did not sound convinced. Their conversation ended quickly. The banker walked outside. The landlord stood still in the lobby for a moment. Then they kicked a trash can hard enough to send it sliding across the floor. For the first time since I moved into the building, I saw something inside the landlord's face. Fear. Real fear. Not the kind tenants feel when rent increases. The kind people feel when millions of dollars sit on the edge of collapse. I walked back into my apartment quietly. My heart was beating faster again, because now I knew something the other tenants did not. The landlord had 60 days before the bank took control. 60 days before the building might go to auction. 60 days before investors arrived. The rent increase was not just a strategy. It was a final attempt to escape financial disaster. I sat at the table again. The notebook lay open in front of me. I wrote 3 words across the top of the page. 60 days left. Then I added another line beneath it. Auction possibility. My mind kept moving. Buying an entire building still sounded absurd. But sometimes absurd ideas grow stronger when the numbers make sense. I started calculating. The loan balance. The building value. The repair costs. The potential rent income. Piece by piece the numbers formed a strange picture. If the auction price dropped low enough, the deal might actually work. But another obstacle appeared immediately. Auctions require money. Large amounts of money. Much more than I had sitting in my bank account. The idea should have died right there. But instead another thought appeared. Buildings do not always sell for cash. Sometimes banks finance buyers after foreclosure, especially when the bank wants to recover losses quickly, which meant the impossible idea might still have a narrow path forward. I closed the notebook and leaned back again. 60 days. That was the amount of time separating me from either losing my home or attempting something no tenant in this building had ever imagined. But before I could even think about auctions or loans, a different problem was already beginning, because the landlord had not finished fighting. And within 2 days, the first eviction notice would appear on my door. The eviction notice arrived faster than I expected. 2 days after hearing the argument in the lobby, someone knocked on my door early in the morning. Not politely. 3 sharp hits. The kind meant to send a message. When I opened the door, a man in a gray jacket stood in the hallway holding a clipboard. He looked tired, like someone who delivered bad news for a living. He handed me a paper without speaking. Then he walked to the next apartment. I closed the door slowly and looked down at the page. Notice of lease violation. According to the landlord, I had failed to follow updated rent terms, which was strange. The new rent had not even started yet, but the notice warned that legal action could begin soon. I read the page twice. The message was clear. The landlord wanted pressure. Pressure pushes tenants out quickly. I placed the notice beside the rent increase letter on the table. 2 pieces of paper, both trying to remove me from the building. Most people would have started packing. Instead, I opened the laptop again, because something about the timing bothered me. The landlord had 60 days before the bank stepped in. Every tenant forced out before that moment made the building easier to sell. Empty apartments attract developers. Developers bring cash buyers. Cash buyers rescue desperate landlords. That meant the eviction notices were not random. They were part of a countdown. And the landlord had just added my name to the list. I walked down the hallway later that afternoon. 2 more doors had notices taped to them. Mrs. Delgado held one in her hand while speaking to a younger tenant. Their faces showed the same mixture of anger and fear. No one wanted to fight. Legal battles cost money, time, energy. Most people move away instead. That was exactly what the landlord expected. But the landlord had made one mistake. They assumed every tenant would react the same way. I returned to my apartment and started writing again. If eviction pressure increased, the building would empty faster, which meant the landlord felt the bank closing in. That thought stayed with me through the evening. Around 9 that night, I stepped outside to throw away trash. The lobby lights were dim. Only one person stood near the mailboxes. The landlord. and across from them stood the same banker I had seen earlier. Their voices were quiet this time, but the stairwell carries sound in strange ways. I stayed near the corner without being seen. The bankers sounded calmer tonight. Calm voices often carry worse news. I heard one sentence clearly. The loan will enter foreclosure processing next week. The landlord cursed under their breath. Then came another sentence that changed everything. Once foreclosure begins, the property will likely be auctioned. The landlord asked if there was another option. The banker answered immediately. Pay the full, overdue balance. Silence followed. Heavy silence. Because everyone standing in that lobby already knew the truth. The landlord did not have that money. After a moment, the banker added something else. Even if you sell quickly, the debt is higher than the current property value. That meant something dangerous. The landlord owed more than the building was worth. Negative equity. Banks hate that situation. It turns foreclosures messy. The conversation continued, but my thoughts had already moved somewhere else. Because that single detail changed the entire situation. If the debt exceeded the property value, investors might avoid the auction. Risk becomes too high. Repairs, legal problems, tenant disputes. Many buyers would simply walk away. I walked back to my apartment slowly. My heart was racing again, because now the idea that had sounded ridiculous before was starting to look different. The building might not attract many buyers, which meant the auction price could fall far below normal market value. That opened a narrow door, a very narrow one. I sat down at the table again. The eviction notice lay beside the rent letter. Both of them meant to push me out. Instead, they pushed me deeper into the situation. I opened the notebook and wrote a new line beneath the earlier notes. Foreclosure confirmed. Auction approaching. Then I wrote something else. Possible low bidding competition. I stared at the words for a long time. Buying a building requires money, connections, knowledge. I had none of those. But I had something investors did not. Time inside this building. 14 years of understanding every corner of it. 14 years of watching how the landlord managed things. 14 years of knowing exactly what needed repairs and what did not. Knowledge reduces risk. Investors would see uncertainty. I would see details. But the biggest obstacle remained obvious. Money. Even at a discounted auction price, the building would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Far beyond what sat inside my savings account. The idea should have ended there. Yet another thought appeared quietly. Banks sometimes finance foreclosure buyers, especially when the bank already owns the property. Instead of losing money during an empty sale, banks sometimes support a buyer who plans to keep the property operating. That thought felt dangerous. Hope can make people reckless, but numbers do not lie. If the building sold cheaply enough, loan payments could be covered by the rent from existing tenants. I started writing calculations again. Apartment count, average rent, repair costs, taxes, loan estimates. Piece by piece, the numbers filled the notebook page. The situation looked risky. Very risky, but not impossible. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time since receiving the rent increase letter, a strange feeling appeared. Control. The landlord believed tenants were powerless. But information changes power. And I now understood something the landlord did not realize. The building was already slipping away. The bank had started taking it, which meant the landlord was no longer the real opponent. The real opponent would appear later. At the auction, investors, developers, speculators, people with far more money than I had. And if I wanted even the smallest chance of standing in that room, I would need help. Real help, legal help, financial advice. Someone who understood foreclosure law better than I did. As I closed the notebook, a memory surfaced. Apartment 2A. An older tenant who rarely left their apartment. A quiet person who once mentioned spending years inside courtrooms before retirement. At the time, I had not asked questions. But tonight, that memory returned with new meaning. Because if there was even a small chance that person understood foreclosure law, then knocking on their door tomorrow morning might change everything. And sometimes one quiet conversation inside a hallway can alter the direction of an entire building. What I did not know yet was that the conversation waiting behind apartment 2A would reveal something far bigger than legal advice. It would reveal a hidden rule inside the foreclosure system. A rule the landlord was desperately hoping no tenant would ever learn. And once I heard it, the idea of buying the building would stop sounding impossible. It would start sounding like a plan. The next morning, I stood outside apartment 2A with my hand hovering near the door. I had walked past this door hundreds of times over the years. The tenant inside rarely spoke to anyone. Quiet, private, observant. I knocked once. No answer. I knocked again. Slow footsteps approached from the other side. The door opened halfway. An older person looked at me through narrow eyes. Not suspicious, just careful. I introduced myself and explained that I lived upstairs. The tenant studied my face for a moment before opening the door wider. The apartment smelled faintly of old books and coffee. Stacks of legal folders covered the dining table. Court documents, case files, yellow notes. I realized immediately my memory had been correct. This person had spent many years around legal work. I explained the situation quickly. The rent increase, the eviction notice, the conversation with the banker, the foreclosure warning. The tenant from 2A listened without interrupting. When I finished speaking, they leaned back in their chair and sighed slowly. Then they asked a question. Did the bank already file foreclosure paperwork? I nodded. They stood up and walked to the table covered in documents. After flipping through several papers, they turned back toward me. Then the landlord has already lost the building. The sentence felt heavy in the room. I blinked. What do you mean? They explained calmly. When banks start foreclosure processing, ownership technically remains with the landlord for a short time, but the control begins shifting toward the bank. The landlord becomes desperate during this stage. They attempt to raise money quickly. They attempt to empty the property. They attempt to avoid the auction. Most attempts fail, because once the foreclosure machine begins moving, it rarely stops. I listened carefully. Then I asked the question that had been growing inside my mind since yesterday. What happens during the auction? The tenant smiled slightly. Not because anything was amusing, because they recognized the direction my thoughts were moving. They pulled a legal book from the shelf and placed it on the table. Then they pointed at a paragraph. Foreclosure auctions follow specific rules. Buyers gather. Bids rise. The highest bidder wins the property. Simple on the surface. But hidden inside those rules was something many people never noticed. The tenant tapped the page again. There is a rule many investors depend on. I leaned forward. They continued speaking. Banks want to recover as much of their loan as possible. If bidding stops far below the debt amount, the bank can step in and take ownership themselves. But sometimes banks prefer another outcome. If a buyer shows a reasonable financial plan and the bid covers a portion of the debt, banks may support that buyer through financing after the sale. I stared at the page. The meaning settled slowly. Someone without massive cash reserves could still purchase the building, as long as the bank believed the buyer could manage the property and repay the loan. I sat quietly for several seconds. Then the tenant asked the question I had been avoiding. Are you thinking about bidding? I hesitated. Then I answered honestly. Yes. The word hung in the air. Instead of laughing, the tenant nodded thoughtfully. You are not the first tenant to consider it. That surprised me. They explained further. In rare situations, tenants organize and purchase their building after foreclosure. Sometimes individually, sometimes as a group. It requires courage, preparation, and a willingness to fight investors who assume tenants have no chance. I felt a strange mix of fear and determination growing inside my chest. Then another concern appeared. The landlord would fight it. The tenant nodded again. Yes, very aggressively. Landlords who face foreclosure often try legal tricks to delay auctions. Eviction pressure, tenant intimidation, false claims, any method that empties the building quickly, because empty buildings sell easier. Then they looked directly at me, which means the eviction notice you received is only the beginning. That sentence landed hard. The landlord would escalate. More notices, more pressure, possibly court filings. But something about that warning strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. The landlord believed intimidation would push me out. Instead, it was pushing me forward. The tenant from 2A walked toward the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee. When they returned, they placed 1 cup in front of me. Then they asked another question. How much money do you have available? I gave the honest answer. Not much. Savings. Some retirement funds. Nothing close to what investors carry. They nodded slowly. That may not matter as much as you think. I looked up. They continued explaining. Foreclosure auctions sometimes scare investors away when properties carry hidden problems. Old plumbing, legal disputes, tenant conflicts, large repair costs. This building had all of those. Investors prefer cleaner deals, which meant bidding competition might stay low. The tenant opened another document and slid it across the table. It was a foreclosure auction notice from years earlier. A building similar in size had sold far below market value because buyers feared legal problems. I studied the document carefully. The idea inside my mind grew stronger. Still risky, still frightening, but now supported by evidence. The tenant finished their coffee and spoke again. If you want to attempt this, preparation must start immediately. They outlined several steps. Study the foreclosure timeline. Understand auction requirements. Prepare financial statements. Speak with the bank. Learn every detail about the building's condition. Most buyers walk into auctions blindly. Knowledge creates advantage. I listened carefully and wrote notes as fast as I could. By the time I stood to leave, an hour had passed. But before I reached the door, the tenant said something else. One more thing. I turned back. The landlord will not wait quietly while a tenant prepares to take the building. I understood immediately. If the landlord suspected my plan, retaliation would become intense. Evictions, legal threats, harassment, anything that would push me out before the auction arrived. The tenant looked directly at me again. You will need to fight in court. Courtrooms, legal filings, public battles. The thought felt intimidating. Yet something inside me refused to step backward. Because every day the landlord tried to remove tenants from the building. And every day the foreclosure clock moved closer to the auction. I stepped into the hallway and closed the apartment door behind me. The building looked the same as always. Old paint, dim lighting, worn carpet. But now I saw something different. Opportunity hidden inside chaos. I walked back toward my apartment slowly. My notebook waited on the kitchen table. New calculations needed to begin. But before I reached my door, I noticed something taped to it. Another piece of paper. A thicker document than the previous notice. Stamped with official markings. My heart sank slightly as I pulled it from the door. This was not just another warning. This was a court filing. The landlord had officially started an eviction lawsuit. And the hearing date printed near the bottom sat only 2 weeks away. The fight had already begun. And if I lost that case, I would be forced out of the building long before the auction ever happened. The courtroom date sat on the eviction notice like a countdown. 14 days. That was the time the landlord had given me to disappear. I placed the document on the kitchen table beside the other papers. Rent increase. Lease violation. Eviction filing. 3 attempts to remove me. And the landlord had only just begun. I sat down slowly and opened the notebook again. Every plan I had started forming now faced a serious problem. If the court approved the eviction, I would lose the apartment before the foreclosure auction even happened, which meant the entire idea of buying the building would collapse before it had a chance to breathe. The landlord understood that. This lawsuit was not about rent. It was about removing a tenant before that tenant became inconvenient. I stared at the court date for a long moment. Then I picked up the phone and walked downstairs. Apartment 2A opened after the second knock. The retired legal worker looked at the papers and sighed quietly. This was expected. They explained the strategy immediately. Landlords often file eviction cases during foreclosure periods. It scares tenants. It empties buildings. Most tenants never fight the case. They leave. But fighting changes the situation. The tenant from 2A pointed at a section of the eviction filing. The landlord claimed I had violated new lease terms. The problem with that claim was simple. Those terms had been announced only days earlier. Courts rarely support sudden lease changes without proper notice periods, which meant the landlord's case looked weak. Still dangerous, but weak. The tenant leaned back in their chair and folded their arms. If you want to stay long enough to attempt the auction, you must win this hearing. I nodded slowly. What do I need to do? The answer came quickly. Documentation. Proof of rent payment history. Copies of the sudden rent increase. Evidence showing the landlord failed to provide reasonable notice. The tenant helped me organize everything on the dining table. Every receipt. Every lease agreement. Every email. 14 years of paperwork suddenly mattered. Hours passed while we arranged the documents into clear order. When the stack was finished, the retired legal worker looked satisfied. This should hold in court. Relief moved through me slowly. But the tenant raised a finger before I could relax. This only wins the first battle. The landlord would not stop after losing once. They would escalate pressure. Maintenance issues might suddenly appear. Utilities might become unstable. Inspections might arrive. The goal would remain the same. Force tenants out quickly. I returned to my apartment late that evening with a folder full of documents. The building hallway felt quieter than usual. 3 apartments were already empty. Their doors stood open while moving crews carried furniture out. Fear had done its job. The landlord's plan was working. Inside my apartment, I placed the folder carefully beside the notebook. 2 battles now existed: the courtroom hearing and the foreclosure auction. Winning the first would give me a chance to attempt the second, but both required preparation. The next few days passed in strange tension. The landlord walked through the building often, inspecting, watching, measuring. Several tenants received additional notices. One family left during the night without telling anyone. Each empty apartment increased the landlord's chances of selling the building quickly. But every tenant who stayed strengthened my calculations. Rental income mattered in the numbers I had written. Without tenants, the plan would fail. On the 6th day, something unusual happened. A maintenance crew arrived suddenly. Not the usual repair workers. These men carried cameras and inspection equipment. They photographed hallways, measured rooms, checked wiring panels, evaluated plumbing. Professional property inspectors. I watched from the stairwell quietly. Inspection reports often appear before property sales, which meant the landlord might be preparing documents for potential buyers. Desperation was pushing them faster. Later that evening, another surprise arrived. A letter from the bank, not addressed to me, but mistakenly delivered to my mailbox. The envelope displayed the bank's logo clearly. Inside was a foreclosure update addressed to the landlord's company. I hesitated for several seconds before reading it. Technically, the letter was not mine, but the information inside could decide the future of the building. I unfolded the page carefully. The words near the center made my pulse rise. The foreclosure auction date had been scheduled, 32 days away, just over 1 month. The clock had started moving much faster than expected. I grabbed the notebook and wrote the date down immediately. 32 days. Not much time, but enough to prepare. The next morning, I visited apartment 2A again. The retired legal worker read the auction notice carefully. Then they nodded. This timeline fits the bank's pressure. They looked directly at me. You now have 1 month to prepare for something most investors plan for years. The weight of that sentence settled heavily on my shoulders. 1 month to gather financial information. 1 month to speak with the bank. 1 month to survive the eviction lawsuit. 1 month to study the auction process. But the tenant from 2A said something else before I left. You are not the only one who knows about the auction. Investors monitor foreclosure notices constantly. Real estate groups watch for opportunities like hunters tracking prey, which meant professional buyers were already studying this building, preparing bids, examining profit margins. If I walked into that auction room unprepared, they would crush me within seconds. I returned to my apartment again. The notebook looked fuller than it had days earlier. Numbers, plans, court dates, auction timelines. Each page pulled me deeper into a battle I had never expected to fight. But that night, another thought arrived. If I wanted any chance at that auction, I needed to speak with the bank before the investors did. Because sometimes the quiet conversations that happen before auctions decide the outcome long before bidding ever begins. And if the bank believed I could manage the building, they might do something investors never expect. They might help the tenant become the buyer. What I did not know yet was that the next meeting with the bank would reveal something shocking about the landlord's financial situation. Something far worse than missed payments. And once that truth appeared, the entire foreclosure battle would turn far more dangerous. The bank building stood 3 blocks away from the courthouse. I walked there early the next morning with the foreclosure letter folded inside my jacket pocket. My hands felt slightly cold, not because of the weather, because I had never walked into a bank to discuss buying an entire apartment building. The thought still sounded absurd in my own head. But the auction date written on that paper had changed something inside me. 32 days. That was no longer a distant possibility. It was a deadline. Inside the bank lobby, everything looked calm. Polished floors, quiet conversations, people discussing mortgages and savings accounts. None of them knew the building down the street was about to collapse financially. I approached the front desk and asked to speak with someone from the loan department. After several minutes, a manager appeared. A middle-aged professional with careful eyes. We sat in a small office with glass walls. I explained why I had come. At first, the manager listened politely. Then the expression on their face changed. Not disbelief, curiosity. When I mentioned the building address, They leaned back in the chair slowly. You live there? I nodded. The manager folded their hands together. That property has been causing serious problems for us. The sentence carried quiet frustration. Banks do not enjoy foreclosures. They cost time and money. The manager asked how I knew about the auction. I showed the letter that had landed in my mailbox by accident. The manager read it carefully, then placed it on the desk. What exactly are you planning? I answered honestly. I want to try to bid on the building. The room became very quiet. For several seconds, the manager simply studied my face, trying to determine whether I understood the situation. Then the manager spoke again. That building carries a large debt. I nodded. I saw the public records. The manager opened a computer file and scrolled through several pages. What they said next made my stomach tighten. The debt is worse than the public record shows. I leaned forward slightly. The manager continued. The landlord had not only missed mortgage payments, they had also taken secondary loans against the property. Short-term loans, high-interest loans, loans from private lenders. The building had become collateral for several financial deals, which meant the total debt tied to the property was enormous, far beyond its realistic market value. I sat quietly while absorbing that information. The landlord had gambled heavily, and now the entire structure was collapsing. The manager sighed. When foreclosure happens, several lenders will attempt to recover money. That meant legal disputes could appear after the auction. Claims, challenges, delays. Investors hate complicated situations like that. Complicated deals scare them away. The thought inside my mind grew stronger. Fewer investors meant less competition. But another problem appeared immediately. Would the bank even allow someone like me to finance the purchase? The manager looked thoughtful. Then they said something unexpected. That depends on one thing. I waited. Whether the buyer can prove the building will continue producing income. Income, rent, tenants. The pieces connected quickly in my mind. If tenants stayed in the building, rental income could support loan payments. But if everyone left, the property would become empty. Empty buildings cannot pay loans, which meant the landlord's attempt to remove tenants might actually destroy the building's value. The manager continued explaining. If a buyer presented a financial plan showing stable rent income and responsible management, the bank might support that buyer with financing after the auction. Not guaranteed, but possible. My pulse began to rise. Would the bank consider that plan from a tenant? The manager smiled slightly. Banks prefer stable outcomes. They explained further. Investors often purchase foreclosed buildings only to flip them quickly. That creates uncertainty. But a buyer who already lives in the building and plans long-term management might look more attractive to the bank, especially when the property already faces legal complications. I felt a strange mixture of hope and pressure building inside my chest, because now the idea no longer sounded ridiculous. It sounded extremely difficult, but possible. The manager leaned forward slightly. You would need financial statements, savings records, credit history, proof of income, a written management plan for the property. And one more thing. They looked at me carefully before speaking again. The building must still have tenants. That sentence carried enormous weight. Rental income supported the entire idea. Without tenants, the numbers in my notebook would collapse, which meant the landlord's eviction campaign threatened more than my home. It threatened the entire strategy. If too many apartments became empty, the bank would never approve financing for any buyer. I asked one final question before leaving the office. Do investors already know about the auction? The manager nodded slowly. Yes. Several real estate groups had already requested property documents, inspection reports, financial histories. The hunters had noticed the wounded property. But the manager added something interesting. Most investors were hesitant. The building carried too many legal complications, too many repair issues, too much debt. That hesitation created opportunity. I thanked the manager and left the bank. Outside, the sunlight felt strangely brighter, because the path in front of me had become clearer. Still dangerous, still uncertain, but visible. 1 month remained. One court hearing, one auction, and now I understood the most important rule of this entire situation. Tenants were the building's lifeline. If tenants stayed, the building still had value. If tenants left, everything collapsed. That meant protecting the remaining tenants had become part of my plan. But when I returned to the building that afternoon, something immediately felt wrong. A large truck stood outside the entrance. Workers were carrying furniture out of another apartment. more tenants leaving. And standing in the lobby watching everything unfold was the landlord, smiling, as if the building was already empty, as if the landlord had already won. What the landlord did not know yet was that the eviction hearing scheduled in 2 weeks would decide far more than my right to stay. That courtroom battle would expose something the landlord was desperately trying to hide, something that could destroy their credibility in front of a judge. And if the judge saw that evidence, the entire eviction case might collapse in front of everyone watching. The morning of the eviction hearing arrived faster than expected. I woke before sunrise and sat at the kitchen table with the folder of documents spread in front of me. Receipts, lease agreements, emails, every piece of proof that showed I had followed the rules for 14 years. Outside the window, the city moved slowly into another day, but inside my apartment, the silence felt heavy. Because this hearing was not just about staying in the building. It was about buying time. Without time, the auction plan would collapse. I placed the documents carefully back into the folder and walked toward the courthouse. The building stood only a few blocks away, but each step felt longer than usual. Inside the courthouse hallway, dozens of tenants waited outside different courtrooms. Some looked nervous. Some looked angry. Housing courts often carry both emotions at once. When I entered the courtroom, the landlord was already sitting at a table with a lawyer. The landlord glanced at me briefly. The look on their face carried quiet confidence, as if this hearing would be quick, as if the outcome had already been decided. I sat down across the room and opened the folder again. The lawyer stood first when the judge entered. The landlord's case was called quickly. The lawyer began speaking immediately. According to the complaint, I had violated updated lease conditions. According to the landlord, the rent adjustment was lawful. According to the landlord, failure to accept those terms justified eviction. The lawyer spoke smoothly, confidently, as if tenants rarely challenged these claims. When the judge finished listening, the room became quiet. Then the judge looked at me. "Do you have a response?" I stood slowly and walked toward the small table in front of the bench. My voice felt steady. I explained the sudden rent increase. I explained the lack of notice. I explained the 14 years of consistent payments. Then I placed the documents on the table. Receipts, lease copies, timeline records. The judge examined the paperwork carefully. The landlord's lawyer tried to interrupt twice. The judge raised a hand and stopped them both times. Several minutes passed while the judge reviewed everything. Then the judge asked the landlord's lawyer a simple question. When were the new lease terms delivered to the tenant? The lawyer answered, 3 days before the notice. The judge leaned back slightly. And you believe 3 days qualifies as reasonable notice? The lawyer hesitated. The silence that followed felt longer than it actually was. Then the judge spoke again. 14 years of payment history is documented here. The judge tapped the receipts. This court does not support sudden lease changes used to force tenants out. The landlord's lawyer attempted another argument, but the judge had already made the decision. The eviction request was denied. Just like that. One sentence ended the landlord's first attempt. The courtroom clerk recorded the ruling while the landlord's lawyer gathered their papers quickly. The landlord did not look at me while leaving the courtroom, but I noticed something different in their posture. Tension. The plan had failed. Outside the courthouse, I stepped into the sunlight and took a slow breath. The first battle was finished, but the war was far from over. I walked back toward the building with a strange sense of calm. Winning the hearing had bought something valuable. Time. But when I reached the entrance of the building, something unusual waited inside. 3 people stood in the lobby examining the hallway. They wore suits. Professional investors. I recognized the behavior immediately. They were studying the property, measuring walls, looking at the ceiling, checking electrical panels. One of them noticed me and nodded politely. Then they returned to their conversation. Auction buyers. The hunters had already arrived. That realization tightened something inside my chest. These were not amateurs. These were experienced real estate buyers who understood foreclosure auctions very well. And they had already started evaluating the building, which meant the auction would not be as quiet as I had hoped. I walked upstairs slowly. Inside my apartment, I opened the notebook again. Investors now had the same timeline I did. 30 days until the auction. But there was still something they did not know. The hidden legal pressure surrounding the landlord's debts. Multiple lenders. Conflicting claims. Complicated paperwork. Those details might scare away some buyers. But professional investors also knew how to navigate legal chaos. The competition would be real. Later that evening, I visited apartment 2A again. The retired legal worker listened carefully while I described the courtroom hearing. They nodded with quiet approval. That ruling will slow the landlord down. But they quickly added something else. Now the landlord will become more aggressive. Failed evictions often lead to different tactics: harassment, utility interruptions, unexpected inspections, anything that makes living conditions uncomfortable. Because frustrated landlords sometimes stop following the rules. I returned upstairs again and locked the apartment door behind me. The building felt uneasy that night. The landlord walked through the hallways twice, talking loudly on the phone, arguing with someone. The financial pressure was clearly growing. But something else was growing too. My plan, the bank conversation, the auction date, the courtroom victory. Every piece had pushed me closer to something unimaginable weeks earlier: buying the building. Yet late that night, another surprise arrived. A loud knock echoed through the hallway. Not polite, not friendly. When I opened the door, 2 city inspectors stood outside. Behind them stood the landlord, watching, waiting. The inspectors explained they had received complaints about building safety issues. They needed to check several apartments immediately, including mine. I stepped aside and allowed them to enter. But the moment they began inspecting the walls and plumbing, I realized something troubling. This was not a routine inspection. This was another strategy. If the landlord could prove the building had safety violations, the city might force tenants to leave. And if that happened, the building would become empty long before the auction ever began. The inspectors walked through my apartment slowly. One checked the plumbing under the sink. The other examined electrical outlets and ceiling fixtures. They wrote notes on a tablet while the landlord stood near the doorway, watching every movement. I stayed quiet. Arguments during inspections never help. Inspectors follow evidence, not emotions. After several minutes, one of them looked toward the landlord. "Do you have the maintenance records for the building?" The landlord hesitated, then answered that the documents were in the office. The inspector nodded and continued checking the apartment. Inside my mind, a different thought was forming. If the landlord had maintained the building properly, inspection reports would show that. But if repairs had been ignored for years, those same reports could expose serious problems. Problems the landlord had chosen to hide. The inspectors finished the apartment inspection and stepped back into the hallway. They continued moving door to door, checking wiring panels, examining stair railings, testing emergency lights. Tenants opened doors nervously while the landlord followed behind them like a shadow. From the stairwell, I watched the process carefully, because something about the landlord's expression looked uneasy, not confident, worried. By late afternoon, the inspectors gathered near the entrance of the building. They reviewed notes quietly for several minutes. Then one of them turned toward the landlord. "The building requires several repairs." The landlord nodded quickly. "Yes, of course, those will be handled immediately." But the inspector continued speaking. "These repairs should have been addressed years ago." The landlord's smile disappeared. The inspector explained the list clearly: outdated electrical wiring, faulty emergency lighting, water damage near several structural beams. None of the issues required immediate evacuation, but the report would be filed with the city, and the landlord would receive official repair orders, deadlines, compliance checks, possible fines. The landlord forced a polite expression and thanked the inspectors. But the moment they stepped outside, anger appeared across their face. Because the inspection had created a new problem. Instead of forcing tenants out, it had produced documented evidence of neglected maintenance. Evidence that could appear in court. Evidence that investors might see before the auction. Evidence that could reduce the property value even further. The landlord stormed toward the office without speaking to anyone. I walked upstairs quietly. Inside my apartment, I sat down and opened the notebook again. Inspection results, repair orders, structural issues. Each detail added weight to the situation surrounding the building. Most investors prefer properties without official repair violations. Violations mean money, time, legal responsibility. The list of complications surrounding this building was growing longer every day, which meant some buyers might step away from the auction entirely. But later that evening, the situation shifted again. I received a phone call from the bank manager I had met earlier. The voice on the phone sounded calm but serious. "We received the city inspection report this afternoon. I leaned back in the chair. That was fast. The manager gave a short response. The city sends those reports to lenders when buildings have active foreclosure cases, which meant the bank already knew the full repair list. The manager continued speaking. These violations make the auction situation more complicated. Complicated situations sometimes delay auctions, sometimes cancel them, but sometimes they do something else. Lower bidding competition. I asked the question directly. Does this help or hurt my chances? The manager paused for a moment before answering. It scares many investors. The manager explained why. Repair orders add immediate expenses after purchase. Some buyers will not want the responsibility. Others will reduce their bidding price dramatically. Either way, the situation had become riskier, and risk changes how auctions behave. The manager added one more detail before ending the call. Several investors had already requested copies of the inspection report. They were studying the property carefully, which meant the hunters were still interested, just more cautious. I placed the phone down and stared at the notebook again. The building now carried a strange combination of problems: debt, repair violations, tenant conflicts, legal disputes. Most people would see disaster, but sometimes disaster hides opportunity. Because the more complicated the situation becomes, the fewer buyers remain willing to fight through it. That night, the hallway outside my apartment stayed quiet, but around midnight, a loud argument echoed from the lobby. I stepped into the stairwell quietly. The landlord stood near the entrance, shouting into a phone. The words were angry and desperate. I caught pieces of the conversation. You promised the investors would come. Now the repair report scares them. I need this building sold before the auction. Sold before the auction. That phrase caught my attention immediately. Because if the landlord managed to sell the property quickly to a private buyer, the foreclosure auction would never happen, which meant my entire plan would collapse instantly. I returned to my apartment slowly. The landlord had changed strategy again. Instead of waiting for the auction, they were trying to find a buyer immediately. A desperate sale. A quick deal. Any buyer willing to take the property before the bank seized control. If that happened, the building would change ownership without warning. Tenants could still be removed. Rents could still increase. And the chance to bid on the building would vanish forever. I opened the notebook and wrote one new sentence across the next page. The landlord is racing the clock. But something about that midnight phone call kept echoing in my head. Because the landlord had said something else during the argument. Something that made the situation far more dangerous. They had mentioned a specific buyer. Someone willing to make a fast private offer. And if that buyer arrived before the foreclosure auction, I would lose the building before ever getting the chance to fight for it. The next morning, the building felt tense. The landlord moved through the hallways more often than usual, talking on the phone, sending messages, waiting. That word stayed in my mind. Waiting. Because after hearing the argument the night before, I understood something clearly. The landlord had found a possible buyer. Someone willing to purchase the building before the foreclosure auction. That kind of deal happens quietly. No public announcements. No open bidding. Just one investor stepping in with a fast offer to rescue the landlord from financial collapse. If that deal happened, the bank might cancel the auction entirely, and my plan would disappear before it had a chance to begin. I needed information. Immediately, I walked downstairs and stepped outside the building. Across the street sat a small cafe where tenants sometimes gathered in the mornings. Mrs. Delgado sat at a corner table drinking coffee. When I joined her, she leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. Someone visited the landlord's office early this morning. My attention sharpened instantly. What did they look like? She described a tall man in a dark coat. Professional. Confident. The kind of person who studies buildings like chessboards. Real estate investors often look exactly like that. Then she added another detail. He brought two assistants. Assistants meant paperwork. Paperwork meant negotiations. My stomach tightened slightly. The landlord was moving quickly. I returned to the building entrance just as a black car pulled away from the curb. 3 people stepped out of the lobby. The man in the dark coat stood in the middle. He glanced up at the building with calculating eyes. Then he shook the landlord's hand before walking toward the car. The landlord smiled. Not the desperate expression I had seen recently. This smile looked hopeful. Dangerously hopeful. I pretended to check my phone while the group passed by, but I listened carefully. One sentence drifted through the air as they walked past. Send the financial reports and inspection records tonight. Financial reports. Inspection records. That meant negotiations had begun. The investor wanted full information before making an offer. I waited until their car disappeared down the street. Then I walked upstairs quickly and knocked on apartment 2A. The retired legal worker opened the door. I explained everything. The investor, the assistants, the conversation, the possibility of a private sale. The tenant listened carefully while leaning against the door frame. Then they said something that calmed me slightly. Selling the building now would be difficult. I asked why. They explained the legal complications. Multiple lenders had claims against the property. The city had issued repair violations. The foreclosure process had already begun. Private buyers usually avoid properties tangled in so many legal problems, unless they believe the price will be extremely low. I thought about the investor's expression again. He had looked confident, very confident, which meant he believed the deal could work. The retired legal worker nodded slowly. If that buyer offers enough money to satisfy the bank, the auction disappears. That sentence landed hard. Everything depended on one number: the offer price. If the investor offered enough to settle the bank's debt, foreclosure would end immediately. The landlord would escape, and tenants would face a new owner with unknown plans. I walked back upstairs slowly. Inside my apartment, the notebook waited on the table again. Another threat had appeared. Auction competition had been expected, but a private sale before the auction was far worse. Because auctions at least allow anyone to compete. Private deals happen behind closed doors. Tenants never get invited to those rooms. I opened the laptop and started searching again. Property records, investor groups, real estate companies. After several minutes, one name appeared repeatedly connected to distressed property purchases. A development company known for acquiring buildings during financial crises. I studied their past deals carefully. They specialized in one thing: buying buildings cheaply, renovating them, then raising rents dramatically. The pattern repeated across several cities. Tenants pushed out, luxury apartments built, profit extracted. If that company bought this building, the future was obvious. Every remaining tenant would eventually be removed. I leaned back in the chair slowly. The situation had become even more urgent. The landlord wanted a quick private deal. The investor wanted a cheap building. The bank wanted repayment, and tenants wanted stability. For different interests pulling the situation in different directions. But one advantage still existed. The investor had asked for financial reports and inspection records. That meant negotiations had not finished yet, which meant there was still time. Later that evening, I walked past the landlord's office quietly. Voices came from inside. The landlord speaking loudly. Another voice responding calmly. The investor had returned. I stopped near the stairwell and listened carefully. The landlord sounded excited, but the investor's voice carried a different tone. Cautious, analytical. One sentence drifted clearly through the hallway. The debt level is higher than we expected. The landlord responded quickly. We can negotiate the price. Then the investor spoke again. The repair violations create additional risk. Silence followed. Then the investor said something else. If the price drops far enough, we might consider it. Price drops. That phrase echoed through my mind. Because investors only push prices down when they sense weakness. And the landlord's weakness had become obvious. I returned to my apartment again. The notebook lay open where I had left it. Everything now depended on two races. The landlord racing to sell the building privately, and the bank racing toward the foreclosure auction. Whichever happened first would decide the building's future. But that night another message arrived that changed everything again. An email from the bank manager. Short, direct, urgent. The subject line contained only 3 words. Auction date moved. My heart started beating faster as I opened the message. Because if the auction had been moved forward, then the landlord's secret deal with the investor might collapse before it even had the chance to finish. I opened the email immediately. The message was short, direct. The bank had changed the foreclosure timeline. The auction would no longer happen in 30 days. It had been moved forward. 14 days. 2 weeks. I read the message twice just to make sure the number was correct. 14 days. The bank had lost patience. When lenders move auctions forward, it usually means negotiations with the borrower have completely collapsed. The landlord had run out of time. I sat in silence for several seconds while the reality settled. The private sale the landlord was trying to arrange suddenly faced a problem. Serious investors take weeks to review complicated property deals, legal paperwork, financial audits. inspection reports. But now the clock had shrunk dramatically. 2 weeks might not be enough for the investor to finish negotiations, which meant the landlord's rescue plan might fail. I grabbed the notebook and wrote the new date in large letters. Auction in 14 days. The room felt smaller suddenly. Every plan I had been building now had to move faster. Financial documents, loan preparation, auction rules. Everything needed to be ready immediately. I stood up and walked toward apartment 2A again. The retired legal worker read the bank email carefully. Then they looked at me with raised eyebrows. The bank is forcing the issue. I asked why lenders sometimes accelerate auctions. They explained calmly. Banks do this when they believe the borrower cannot recover the loan. Instead of waiting through endless negotiations, the bank moves directly toward liquidation. Selling the property quickly allows them to stop financial losses, which meant something very important had happened behind the scenes. The landlord must have failed a final negotiation attempt. The bank had given up. That realization made something clear. The landlord's desperate meeting with the investor yesterday had probably been a last attempt to save the building. But now the bank had taken control of the timeline. The retired legal worker leaned back in the chair. This actually helps you. I asked how. They explained that private buyers rarely rush complicated purchases in 2 weeks. Investors want time. Time to study risks. Time to calculate profits. Without that time, many buyers step away, which meant the investor negotiating with the landlord might abandon the deal completely. I returned to my apartment with a strange mixture of hope and pressure. The path toward the auction had suddenly become real. But preparation time had also disappeared. 14 days. 2 weeks to prepare for something most buyers prepare for months. That evening, the building hallway buzzed with rumors. Someone had seen the investor leaving quickly earlier that day. Someone else heard the landlord shouting again in the office. News travels quickly inside apartment buildings. Tenants sensed something was happening, but no one understood the full story. I stayed quiet and continued preparing. The next several days became a blur of activity. Bank statements printed, credit reports requested, income records organized. I visited the bank again and delivered the documents to the manager. They reviewed everything carefully. Then they asked several difficult questions. Repair budgets, tenant occupancy, future maintenance plans. I answered each question using the numbers from my notebook. The manager listened closely. Then they said something encouraging. If the auction price stays low enough, financing might be possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. That single word carried enormous weight. Possible. But the manager added a warning. Investors sometimes appear at the last moment. Experienced buyers often avoid early attention. They watch quietly, then arrive on auction day ready to act, which meant the room could still fill with competitors. The next morning, I returned home to another surprise. A large envelope taped to my apartment door. Legal documents. I opened it slowly. Inside was a new court filing. The landlord had submitted another complaint, this time accusing several tenants of damaging property. The claim was ridiculous, but the intention was obvious. If the landlord could create legal chaos before the auction, potential buyers might become nervous. Legal disputes lower property values. Lower values help desperate sellers negotiate private deals. The landlord was still trying to scare away auction buyers. But something inside the documents caught my attention. One attachment listed repair estimates prepared by the landlord's contractor. Electrical replacement, structural reinforcement, water damage repairs. The numbers were enormous, far larger than the inspection report suggested. I stared at the pages carefully. Then a strange thought appeared. What if those repair estimates were exaggerated? If the landlord was inflating repair costs to scare investors? That strategy could backfire badly, because exaggerated repair reports can also expose financial manipulation. I placed the documents beside the notebook. The situation had become a complicated battlefield. The landlord fighting the bank. The landlord negotiating with investors. Tenants defending their homes. And the foreclosure auction approaching rapidly. 14 days. But late that evening, something unexpected happened. A knock sounded on my door again. When I opened it, the retired legal worker from apartment 2A stood there holding a folder. Their expression looked serious. Inside the folder were copies of financial records connected to the building. Records they had quietly obtained from public filings earlier that day. They placed the documents on my table and pointed at one specific line. The landlord had falsified financial reports submitted to lenders. Rent income numbers had been exaggerated. Repair expenses had been manipulated. Loan applications had been built on incorrect information. Financial fraud. I looked up slowly. If those records were accurate, the situation had just become explosive. Because financial fraud inside a foreclosure case does not stay quiet. It reaches courtrooms, investigations, and sometimes criminal charges. The retired legal worker closed the folder gently. If this information reaches the judge before the auction, they paused. The landlord's entire defense could collapse, which meant something incredible might happen. The tenant fighting eviction might suddenly hold the evidence that could destroy the landlord's position completely. The folder sat on my kitchen table like a silent warning. Financial records, loan documents, income reports. Each page revealed something deeply troubling. The landlord had reported rent income numbers to lenders that did not match the actual rent tenants were paying. The difference was not small. It was massive. Entire apartments listed as producing income far above reality. Repair expenses inflated beyond reasonable amounts. Loan documents built on exaggerated property value estimates. I read the pages again slowly. Then once more. The retired legal worker from apartment 2A stood quietly across the table, watching my reaction. This type of reporting can attract serious attention, they said calmly. Financial institutions rely on accurate property data when approving large loans. If those numbers are manipulated, the entire loan structure becomes questionable, which meant the landlord's debt problems might not be the only issue. There could be legal consequences. Serious ones. I leaned back in the chair and took a slow breath. The building had already become a battlefield of money and desperation. Now another layer had appeared. Fraud. The retired legal worker pointed to one specific document. This report was submitted during the landlord's refinancing 3 years ago. I examined the page carefully. According to the document, the building had nearly full occupancy and rising rent income. But I remembered that year clearly. 3 apartments had been empty for months during that period, which meant the numbers were impossible. The landlord had created a financial illusion to secure a larger loan. I looked up again. What happens if this reaches the bank? The answer came immediately. The bank would open an investigation. Foreclosure would accelerate. Legal protection for the landlord would weaken, because lenders do not tolerate manipulated financial statements. But the retired legal worker added something else. This information could also affect the auction. If investors discovered financial misrepresentation tied to the building, many would hesitate to become involved. Legal uncertainty scares buyers, especially professional investors who protect their reputation carefully. That meant the evidence inside this folder could change the entire auction environment. Fewer competitors, lower bidding pressure, greater opportunity. But the situation carried risk too. If the landlord discovered we had these records, retaliation could become aggressive. Very aggressive. The retired legal worker closed the folder and looked directly at me. You must decide how to use this information. Several options existed. Report the evidence to the bank. Submit the documents during legal proceedings. Or hold the information quietly until the right moment. Timing mattered. Revealing the evidence too early could create unpredictable consequences. But revealing it at the right moment could shift the balance completely. That night, I studied every page inside the folder again. Financial statements, loan approvals, property evaluations. The pattern was obvious. The landlord had stretched numbers beyond reality, perhaps hoping rising property values would hide the deception later. But the market had turned. Debt had grown. And now foreclosure had exposed everything. The building had become a collapsing tower of financial mistakes. I placed the documents carefully back into the folder. Then I opened the notebook again. Auction in 10 days. 10 days to prepare. 10 days to gather every advantage possible. 10 days before the future of the building would be decided inside one room. But early the next morning, another development appeared. A legal notice taped to the entrance of the building. City authorities had scheduled a compliance hearing regarding the repair violations. The hearing date, 3 days before the auction. That detail caught my attention immediately. Because compliance hearings require landlords to present maintenance records, inspection histories, repair documentation. If the landlord appeared in that hearing while hiding manipulated financial reports, the situation could unravel quickly. Later that afternoon, I visited the bank again. The manager studied several pages from the folder carefully. Their expression slowly changed from curiosity to concern. "These numbers are inconsistent," they said quietly. Then they asked where I had obtained the records. I explained that they were public filings connected to earlier loan approvals. The manager nodded slowly. Financial accuracy matters greatly in foreclosure cases. They did not say the word fraud, but the implication was obvious. The manager leaned forward slightly. "If competing investors become aware of this situation, some may withdraw from the auction, because no investor wants to purchase a property entangled in financial investigations, especially when the previous owner may face legal scrutiny." That evening, I returned to the building with a clearer understanding. The landlord was losing control on several fronts: debt pressure, repair violations, legal disputes, and now questionable financial records. But the landlord was not finished fighting. When I entered the lobby that night, two unfamiliar people stood near the office door. Lawyers. Their briefcases and formal posture made that obvious immediately. The landlord spoke with them in a tense voice. I passed by quietly without drawing attention, but one sentence reached my ears clearly. "We must stop the auction." The lawyers responded calmly. "There may still be options. Stopping a foreclosure auction requires powerful legal intervention, emergency filings, court petitions, negotiations with lenders. But such actions usually require strong legal arguments. And if the landlord's financial records were already under suspicion, those arguments might collapse quickly." I returned upstairs slowly. The auction clock kept ticking. 9 days. Yet as I sat at the kitchen table reviewing the notebook again, a strange realization appeared. The landlord was fighting desperately to stop the auction. But if the auction happened, the building could change ownership forever. And the person holding the strongest position inside that room might not be an investor at all. It might be the tenant who refused to leave. What I did not know yet was that the day of the auction would bring a final twist no one in the building expected. Because when the bidding started, the person sitting quietly in the back row would reveal something that changed the entire outcome. Auction day arrived quietly. No dramatic announcement. No crowd outside the building. Just a gray morning and a room inside the courthouse where properties changed owners in minutes. I arrived early. Very early. The retired legal worker from apartment 2A had advised me to watch the room before anything started. Observe the investors. Understand who the competition might be. The auction hall looked simple. Rows of chairs. A long table at the front. Stacks of property files arranged neatly by number. Each file represented someone's financial disaster. Each file represented opportunity for someone else. I sat in the back row and waited. Gradually the room filled. Men and women carrying folders. Investors speaking quietly to partners. Some looked confident. Some looked bored. Experienced buyers often appear calm during auctions because they understand the numbers before they walk into the room. My building sat inside one of those folders at the front table. A property that had once been home. Now a financial asset waiting for bids. I felt my heart beating harder. Not from fear. From the weight of the moment. 14 years of living inside that building had brought me to this room. The auction officer entered shortly after. They organized the files and began explaining the rules. Each property would be called individually. Bidding would begin at a starting price determined by the bank. Highest bid wins. Simple process. But nothing about this situation felt simple. The first few properties passed quickly. Investors raised hands. Numbers climbed. Buildings sold. Each deal finished within minutes. Then the auction officer picked up the folder connected to my building. The room grew slightly quieter. Because complicated properties attract careful attention. The officer announced the address. Then the opening bid. The number was lower than I expected. Much lower. The inspection violations. Debt complications. Legal risks. All of those problems had pushed the starting price down. The officer asked for bids. For several seconds nobody moved. Then one investor near the front raised a hand. The number increased slightly. Another investor followed. The bidding moved slowly, carefully, no aggressive jumps. Everyone in the room understood the property carried risk. I watched quietly while calculating the numbers inside my mind. The price still remained within the range I had prepared for. Then something unexpected happened. The investor I had seen speaking with the landlord earlier entered the room. The tall man in the dark coat. He walked calmly toward the front row. The room shifted slightly as several investors recognized him. Experienced buyers know each other. They understand who carries serious money. The tall investor raised his hand immediately. The bid jumped higher. Another investor hesitated before responding, then raised their hand again. The numbers climbed. My pulse began moving faster. The price approached the upper limit of what I believed the bank might finance. The tall investor raised his hand again. Another increase. The room fell quiet for a moment. No one else moved. The auction officer looked around. Any higher bids? Silence. The tall investor seemed ready to win. The officer began counting down. Going once. At that moment I raised my hand. The room turned slightly. The auction officer nodded. New bid recorded. The tall investor turned and looked toward the back row. For the first time our eyes met. There was no anger in his expression, just curiosity, because tenants rarely appear in foreclosure auctions. But I had prepared for this moment. The tall investor raised his hand again. The number climbed. My heart pounded harder now, but I raised my hand once more. The room remained silent except for the numbers being announced. Back and forth. Two bidders. Everyone else watching. The tall investor paused briefly, calculating, studying. Then he raised his hand again. The number reached the very edge of my financing estimate. One more increase could end my chances. The auction officer looked toward me again. Any higher bids? The room waited. My mind moved quickly. The bank manager had said financing might work if the price stayed within a certain range. But the final decision would depend on the bank's confidence in the buyer. And I had something the tall investor did not. I stood up slowly. Every person in the room watched. Then I spoke clearly. I live in that building. The room grew silent. I know every repair needed. I know every tenant still living there. And I have already spoken with the bank about maintaining the property. The auction officer looked toward the bank representatives sitting near the front. They nodded quietly. The tall investor studied me carefully. Then he leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he lowered his bidding card. Just like that. The competition ended. The auction officer looked around the room again. Any higher bids? Silence. Going once. Going twice. The gavel struck the table. Sold. The word echoed inside the room. Sold. The folder closed. The building changed ownership in that moment. For several seconds I did not move, because the reality felt unreal. The building where I had lived for 14 years, the place where the landlord had tried to push everyone out, now belonged to the tenant who refused to leave. Several investors gathered their papers quietly. The tall investor walked past my chair before leaving. He stopped briefly. You understood the building better than anyone else in this room, he said calmly. Then he walked away. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt different. Not brighter, just heavier with meaning. Because the fight had lasted weeks. Courtrooms, inspections, legal threats, financial pressure. But the final moment had lasted only seconds. One raised hand, one final bid, and the entire story changed direction. Later that evening, I returned to the building again. Tenants stood in the hallway talking nervously about rumors from the courthouse. When I stepped inside, the conversation stopped. Everyone looked at me, waiting. I took a slow breath. Then I told them the truth. The building has a new owner. They waited for the rest of the sentence. I smiled slightly. You were looking at them. Silence filled the hallway. Then Mrs. Delgado began laughing with relief. Other tenants followed, because the fear that had filled the building for weeks suddenly disappeared. But the biggest twist came later, because the very next morning I placed a notice in the lobby. A new rent announcement. Tenants gathered around to read it. Many expected another increase. Instead, they saw something no landlord had ever written before. The rent would stay exactly the same. No sudden increases. No forced removals. Just stable homes. Because the person who owned the building now understood something the previous landlord never did. Homes are not numbers inside a loan document. They are lives. And protecting those lives had turned the tenant into the owner. If this story surprised you, remember one thing. Sometimes the person with the least power at the beginning of a story becomes the one who changes the ending. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and watch the next story waiting on your screen.